And I always say these whitey honkies are bad. What do I always say about voter ID laws? What do I always say about voter ID laws? What I always say to dummies is like, dude, you're... What is this? Fundamentally misunderstand what I always say. While I myself am not a revolutionary Marxist at all, okay? I always say, what do I always say? At this current stage, there is no vanguard party. And that's why I always say, like, lawyers are just Reddit debate lords, okay? This is why I always say, like, I don't have a baby-like point of view. That's why I always say, like, young folk have an anarchist slant to them. That's why I always say one of the only industries where there is a tremendous amount of meritocracy, like actual meritocracy, is athlete. This is what I always say when I say Democrats should be a little bit more like Republicans. That's why I always say, like, I'm really fortunate that I was able to find like a really awesome group of people to play with, right? That's why I always say European racism hits different. I say the same thing that I always say to other motherfuckers, right? Like, back when, you know, homophobia, and that's why I always say, like, it has to come from a separate, like, puritanical point of view. I mean, I always say that, dude. If you're a fucking capitalist, if you're a hyper capitalist defending billionaires and shit, I want to see the details. So that's why I always say, like, if you believe that there's going to be like a communist Rojava, like an anarcho-communist Rojava state, like, you're delusional. Sorry. I always... Man says story time. Richard Spencer is a famous American Nazi. That's why I always say, like, this threat that Manchin is going to go into the Republican Party is a laughable one. This is why I always say there are many tools to fucking pressure congressional Democrats beyond just like finger wagging. This is why I always say, like, part of me is just like, whenever I'm fucking shitting on hogs and stuff, I always tell you, like, your parents are probably in the situation. What do I always say when hogs come in here and they get mad at me? What do I always tell them? We're going to keep laughing at you, dumbasses. What do I always say? Unbiased media is not a real thing, okay? Every outlet is biased. I always say that. That's why I always say
keep up the
that, like, my Discord, for example, is not a fully safe space. Every time I say anything about his house, I always say, like, fucking Pablo Escobar ass house, dude. I always say, when someone tells me they're from Salt Lake, I always say, are you a recovering addict or are you a Mormon? This is why I always say I fucking turn into L. Ron Hubbard whenever this stuff comes on.
Everything else.
Which is why I always say, it's fucking, I have an insane amount of privilege. I always say, like, no. That's why I always say, you listen to one fucking idiot on the right and you listen to all the arguments. That's why I always say, like, you fucking argue with, like, the lowest rung conservative Redditor and it's the exact same arguments. But I always say the same things. There are 3 factors that I look to. Is there instances? What do I always say? 30% of Americans will agree on anything, okay? You can find 30% of Americans that agree on literally anything. That's why I always say this argument that, like, you know, we're fucking releasing criminals and allowing them to do crimes is silly as fuck. I always say, don't know the lyrics, like, that's why I always say, I agree, but I also see the downside of never having your viewpoints challenged with opposing views. Yeah, motherfucker, what do you think? I always say it's not real. What the fuck's wrong with you? Which is precisely why I always say, look, I fucking stopped the Ukrainian invasion. That's precisely why I always say there's bipartisan support for this. Democrats do the same thing, but just more gay, okay? This is why I always say, like, listen, undocumented immigrants deserve to be American citizens more than, like, 90% of people that were born here, straight up. That's why I always say Joe Manchin has to be a Democrat. Even though, what do I always say? They shouldn't have given those nukes up. You had the warheads. You should have kept them. You fucked up Ukraine. And I used to say, like, what do you want? You want him to fucking, like, literally murder like a Haitian child crossing the border or something? And that's why I always say, like, America has single-handedly almost, they could end this tomorrow. They could end this yesterday. What do I always say? What do I always say? Canada is quite literally just an American colony, okay? Or not even an American colony, it's just a state. This is why I always say this is different than Crimea. Look how well they're being celebrated as heroes. What do I always say? Conservatives hate conservatives in other countries for their conservatism. This is why I always say, like, I always say it. I hate it when you guys, like, literally go and, like, fuck shit up on people's accounts. What do I always say? Libtard colleges, okay, liberal arts universities are manufacturing the next generation of Democratic voters. So I always say, look, have fun then. I always say, like, there's a part of people's brains, like it's like a puzzle piece that's missing from some people, but that I always say, like, I always use the Russian example of imperialism as a way for them to comprehend. This is the reason why I always say Ilhan Omar is one of the bravest, if not the bravest congressperson. Be normal. What do I always say? Be fucking normal. Another thing I always say is, look, at least it's good. You know what I mean? If you're making movies being like, America, fuck yeah. This is why I always say, like, when you go full God, when you go God mode, like, you're just going to lose a big chunk of your audience. What do I always say? If you're going to do an accent of people who have, like, been historically colonized, you have to do it well. See, that's why I always say you need care and energy. You literally need care and power to ensure that your movement is successful. What do I always say? You can get 30% of Americans to agree on anything. Except, and to them I always say, motherfucker, that's literally TV. What do I always say? These people in positions of power are there because they're just lucky, okay? Luck is a profoundly important factor. That's why I always say, touch fucking grass. What do I always say? You go to the gym that much, you're gay. This is why I always say it's not for everybody. Like, these kinds of panels are really fucking annoying to conduct. That's why I always say, like, you know, I'm not a debate lord. I don't like debates. That's why I always say Crimea is different. Crimea is different. Shut the fuck up about Crimea. You're literally muddying the waters for no fucking reason. That's why I always say 3 rules. Get a nuke if you want to fucking do nation building. Okay? What do I always say? What do I always say, dude? Never give up your fucking nukes, okay? It's like what I always say about getting in fights. Even if you win the fight, you still lost, right? What do I always say? Republicans do not win elections. It's like I always say, they're married, so they're like the same person. That's why I always say, all you need to do is be a 7, and every man can be a 7. What do I always say? If you're gonna go... What do I always say about these dumbass conservatives, like, you know, the tradcath people on fucking TikTok and shit? Put the phone down. I always say this on my stream.
We have to go to jail together for 6 months. 6 months is
well,
my gold time. Like, you know, for entering men's ass.
That's why I always say, like, I try to use my privilege for good. What do I always say about reactionary motherfuckers all around the world? They are always the same. It's one note, motherfucker. What do I always say? Remember, if there's a clear through line between understanding or having a more... that's why I always say the 30-70 thing. That's why I always say, like, conservatives regularly shit on the conservatives of other countries for their conservatism. I always say, there's no excuse for this, but what do I always say? Government is big, government's necessary, and government is expensive. That's what I always say. I always talk about fucking every dude is a 7. Every dude can easily become a 7
for sure.
if they take care of themselves. What I always say is that no matter which way you do it, having more ownership over your own, what do I always say when assessing the Me Too claims that come out? One of the things that you look for is a repeated pattern. What do I always say? In the absence of real fucking political movements and a real sense of community that we can feel, this is why I always say it's a powder keg, okay? Waiting to explode. And the prevalence of guns and the ease of access to weapons makes it so much more, so much easier to always say that. And structural change and being ruthless towards the systems and trying to enact any kind of systemic change. What do I always say? Let people be cringe and let people be annoying. I get very frustrated. Very, very, very frustrated. Yeah. Dude, I always say chatters need to touch grass, but like this chatter literally touched grass and work. This is why I always say, dude, what do I fucking say? Regulation is written with the with blood, okay? Which is why I always say I want the Democrats to at least play by the same style that Republicans play, but they don't care. They don't have the same priorities. They don't give a shit. Like I always say, the reason why I do what I do, regardless of the fucking nuisances that I have to deal with and how annoying people are. I always say reality TV producers are demons. I always say this, but like in Los Angeles, a regular trip to 7-Eleven is a significantly more deadly mission By the way, this is why I always say vote down ballot. And voting is still significant. It's still important.
So that's why I always say, like, it's a worse player in the field overall, but it's not the output itself.
I always say, like, kids have an anarchist tendency. You know what I always say? Like, when you lose in Valorant, in a lot of instances, it might feel like you're just getting punished for no fucking reason. Like, all jokes aside, I know I always say, like, mogul male, right wing, whatever. Remember, that's why I always say all matter of regulation is written with blood. That's the ink that they use to set new regulations. That's why I always say it doesn't matter. That's why I always say as a white person that, like, when fucking you know, some random like young black zoomer is like chirp. This is why I always say the dudes that fucking talk about nofap actually are probably better off nofapping. Dude, this is why I always say the Brandon IRS or the Obama IRS, for example, which conservatives still complain about to this fucking day, we're doing what they're supposed to do. As I always say, you know, the Republican policy is like pretty much aligned across the board where everyone's a liberal. As I always say, like, everyone's a liberal. The oil and gas lobby, they're liberals too. That's why I always say a lot of people say like, oh, he's such a drama farmer. He's such a drama farmer. So what do I always say? In our current capitalist economic system, the gains are privatized, but the losses are socialized. I always say, false allegations are rare, super rare, and it is infinitely more likely that someone that comes out with allegations, and he's got trans on the mind, baby. Like I always say, these motherfuckers can't stop. That's why I always say these wokesters are jokesters, and we need to put an end to that. These woke banks. I always say, yeah, you said it yesterday. Just say you don't like someone, you're intellectualizing your hatred. Exactly. Like, this is why I always say nation states do nation state shit. That's why I always say, like, billionaires don't have any, like, you know, billionaires cannot be defined by left-right political. That's why I always say Oprah motherfucking Winfrey has infinitely more privilege than a random white homeless. As much as I shit on them, I always say people that come from Canada to the United States of America are either the best or the worst. What do you have to say to that? I always say, listen, corruption is an inevitability in most power structures. That's why I always say I want to suck cop cocks so hard that they fucking die from the greatest nut that they've ever had in their entire lives. You know what I mean? This is why I always say we don't have enough information. We don't know. What do I always say? Sometimes good people do bad things. Okay. Addressed it. Are we happy? Moving on. What do I always say, dude? It's time for, you know, we've been talking about women's rights for far too long. How about it's time for women's wrongs, you know? Like I always say, some of you fucking dumbass leftists need to stop reading theory and read the room, okay? That's why I always say, like, you know, the 4chan fucking weirdos. This is why I always say, like, one aspect that's oftentimes not talked about in a country like Turkey. Always say, or what I always say, don't believe anything you see on TikTok. Because everything on TikTok is a lie. Get nukes. No, that's not what I always say. I have said that. I've said that quite a lot. But that's not the only thing I always say. I say a lot of things over and over again. Okay? I repeat myself quite a bit. What do I always say? Be charitable. All cops lie. 30% of Americans can agree on anything. Bias wants to be confirmed. Whoever has more stickers on their car is more mentally. What do I always say? That means someone's getting paid $1 billion off of your work. Okay? What do I always say? Rhetorical question. Do not respond. He's about to play a clip from 2014 and there's nothing you can do about it. He is your dad. You know what I always say? When the money calling, you got to pick up, you know? That's why I always say, like, it's the fucking centrist blue dog Democrats that are the rotating villains inside of the fucking National Democratic Party that are the real villains. What do I always say? Everyone doesn't compartmentalize that way. What about people who consume child porn and Nazi content? That's why I always say this motherfucker is like he is absolutely in collaboration, in cahoots. Which is why I always say, like, there's a better way out there, a better solution. If it's all make work and it's all fucking bullshit, like I always say, go to the gym, figure out what haircut works on top of your head, and figure out how to groom yourself like your face. Okay?